Welcome. We're glad you found this recorded presentation by the Knox County Master Gardeners. We are a volunteer community service group affiliated with the University of Tennessee, as well as Tennessee State University and their cooperative extension programs. The mission of the Knox County Master Gardener program is to educate and serve the community using research-based information on best practices in horticulture, environmental stewardship, and integrated pest management. One of the ways we educate is through our Speakers Bureau. We normally present to live audiences 4 times a month, with 2 topics being presented twice, once on a Saturday at a county branch library, and a repeat on a weekday at a county senior center. But with COVID-19, these are not normal times. During May, all 4 of our regular county venues were closed. The duration of those closures is expected to be 8 weeks. And because of our affiliation with the University of Tennessee, we are banned from any public gathering of any size until August 1. So, after sitting on the sidelines during April and May, we have found an alternate way to present the talks that we had on the schedule for June and July. It is likely that we will continue this alternate delivery method in August. We hope to be back in front of live audiences for September and October, and if we are, we plan to record those sessions. If group gatherings of up to 50 people are still prohibited, we will complete our planned schedule using this new format. On the slide, you see our website address and a portion of our website homepage. The website provides information on Knox County Master Gardener projects and activities, and includes a calendar of events. All of our Speakers Bureau talks are on this calendar and include the name of the presenter, the topic, and a brief description. For the talks given in this alternative method, you will also find the link to where the recorded presentation can be found. Thanks again for finding this particular recording, and now let's get started with the actual presentation.
Hello, my name is Lynn Carlson. I'm here to talk to you today about warm weather weed wrangling. What a tongue twister, huh? I've put together this presentation in conjunction with Jean Hess. Both of us are Knox County Master Gardeners in Knox County, Tennessee. Jean is responsible for much of the artwork, all of the artwork really, and much of the research involved in helping you deal with your August weeds. Now, we usually like to start by saying, what is a weed anyway? And I'm sure you all are familiar with the simplistic definition that a weed is a plant in the wrong place. Sometimes things are very beautiful, but they're still in the wrong place. But some of them can be good. You'll see some dandelions and maybe some mustard greens in that salad there. You never can tell what might be good and edible, even though it's a wild plant that you wouldn't necessarily want right next to your roses. Or there's also the possibility that weeds will help you control erosion because they'll grow almost anywhere. I'm sure you have seen opportunities for this to happen in new construction areas where all of the topsoil has been skinned off. And weeds will help control what's left until it's time to plant some actual desirable grass. It's also good that wildlife can be supported with some of the wild plants and the weedy plants that we would not normally be interested in. These little bunnies are actually sheltering in, I think that's golden ragwort, which is not a particularly good garden subject, though it is a pretty nice thing to see in a meadow. And you'll find many other options, especially for food for wildlife and so on. However, we're really going to look at this kind of thing. We're going to look at places where it's not so good to have weeds. Here's an example. In someone's yard where the place around a nice tree, looks like it might be a cherry tree, is completely overrun with things that are undesirable. This was a relatively early in the year sort of thing. But you can see, if you look hard, some plantains, maybe some violets, maybe some trees that are growing where they shouldn't, maybe some crabgrassy sorts of things. And down in the corner, you might actually see some poison ivy. And we really don't want those kinds of things around. There are things we need to do to get rid of them. And the first thing really that's best for you is to identify your enemy. Figure out what kind of a weed you're dealing with, because that will usually help you decide what to do about it. Now, the easiest way for you to look at things is leaf shape. What color are the leaves? What texture are the leaves? Are they prickly? Are they fuzzy? Are they smooth? Are they bluish green, light green, almost white? Do they have flowers? That's an easy thing for you to do, but a more important thing really in the long run is to figure out what kind of a root type your weed has that you're concerned about, because if you've got a deep taproot like with this dandelion, how you deal with it is going to be very different from how you deal with that grassy thing on the left. That is annual bluegrass. It's usually long gone by this time of year, but it's easy to pull when you see it because it has a shallow root system. So if you can identify the root system, it helps you deal with what you're doing. The other thing that you have to understand is, what does it look like at different stages of its life? This is the same plant here. On the right, you will see what you might see in the springtime for a plant called horseweed. It really doesn't look very ugly, and you might even think it's a chrysanthemum or a coneflower or something of that sort. Whereas if you let it wait, what you'll see is what's over here on the left, not this bush here, which is a desirable bush, but this tall, skinny, going to flower and seed thing that's like 8 feet tall. It grows that way when it gets to be hot weather. So if you see it at its early stage, right there, then you can deal with it before it gets to the stage of spreading seeds. How does your plant spread that you're concerned about? This one, for instance, spreads mainly by seed, not by runners that go along underground and put up new plants here, there, and everywhere. So you really need to get this one before it stops blooming and goes to seed, whereas other things that have runners are somewhat more difficult to deal with. And you need to understand that. When do they go to seed is important. You have to catch them before that, if you can. August probably, maybe even in July, depending on what the weather's been like for this particular plant. Others don't seed until October, perhaps. Others, early plants, sometimes will seed in May. You need to get things before they spread. Don't forget that. What we're going to do next is talk to you a little bit about specific plants you might have found in your garden. They'll be our particular bugaboos, and I'm sure we could spend several hours looking at different kinds of weed people have had to deal with in the Knox County area. We've had to restrict ourselves to 10 because of the time frame involved. So here's our 10 least favorites. And up first is bindweed, and it's a really tricky one to get rid of. It has a very pretty flower. A white one, looks rather like a morning glory. The difficulty with bindweed, of course, is that it will spread by seed if it gets so far as to make flowers, but it has underground runners that go very, very deep, very, very far, and can overrun everything. And if you can't get rid of those underground running roots, you're in deep trouble. You have to be concerned about getting as much of that deep root as possible. It's probably beginning to flower right now along hedgerows and so on. Let's show you an example that Jean actually took apart out of her garden in about 10 minutes one year. Mostly bindweed here. I think there's some morning glory in it as well. And this is just top growth, really. She'll have the same thing again because getting all those little roots out is going to be rather tricky. But you have to do the best you can with the tools that you have. This one is my bugaboo. Its common name is hairy crabweed. It can also be called mulberry weed. And it's one of those things that's an import. It's only been imported for about 30 years from the Southeast Asia area. But what you ran into with this one is it starts to sprout in April or May, April probably, and as soon as it has 4 leaves, it will start to flower and produce seeds, and it will keep on doing that all summer. Sometimes it's 4 feet tall by the end of the summer if you haven't caught it, shedding seeds all the way. It has a taproot, but it's not a very deep taproot, and of course a lot of little feeder roots. If you can get the taproot out of it, then it won't come back for you. You do have to get this one early if you can, because of all that seed production. It's very viable. If you've bought anything from a nursery in the past 30 years, you probably have some of this, because it's been a very common and difficult to control nursery weed. It spreads mainly by seed. It does not spread by runners, the underground roots, but it has so many seeds that it's quite a problem. Here is one that you'll be seeing going into flower very soon now. It's getting bigger and bigger. Nutsedge looks like a grass. There are a lot of actual sedges that do make good grassy looking things in a flower bed or even in a lawn. They're a little prickly about the edges perhaps. They don't have thorns, but they're a little rough about the edges. But nutsedge is definitely a weed that you need to deal with. If you look at the drawing here, which will help you a little bit, you'll see that there are little nutlets at the end of the roots. Those little nuts are like tubers that will keep throwing up new plants and new plants and new plants. And when you try to get rid of your nutsedge, those little nutlets stay behind and they just produce a new plant. So it's a common weed that we have to deal with, and one that's rather difficult to contend with. The seed heads will look something like this. You'd rather not let it go to seed, but those roots are the things that are more concern to you. Usually you can pick it before it goes to seed here and get rid of it. Now, we've got 2 things to think about here. This one is probably a hop clover, but black medic is a very similar plant. It's low growing. It has a little yellow flower like a clover and a leaf rather like a clover. The difficulties that you run into with this one is that it has a tough stem, and usually you can find a single place where it joins the ground and can try to pull it up there, but the tough stem is not very strong. So if you pull it, you generally pull a piece of the plant and don't always get all of the stem. The other problem you run into with this particular weed is that it will root at every place where a leaf node touches the ground, so it can spread that way as well. You need to catch all of those places and also the main stem going into the ground if you're trying to get rid of this one. You would particularly like to get rid of this one because it's another one that seems to give you some difficulty trying to grow anything around it. It discourages other things growing underneath it, and that's not necessarily good. That's not what you want. Now, all of these are things that you might find in your lawn. We're really only concerned with dealing at the present time with how to get them out of your flower beds. Here is a drawing that gives you a better idea of how the thing grows together and a close-up of one of the flowers, so that you can get an idea. Low growing, remember, it might have a red stem, might look like a little yellow clover, but it's not something you want to have. You'll be finding copperleaf anytime now, going to bloom and going to seed. It's one of those that starts producing flowers and seeds as soon as it's only a few inches tall, but it might be 3 or 4 feet tall by the end of the summer if you don't catch it, spreading seeds all the way. It is an annual. It does have a single main root that is not particularly deep, and you can actually work on that. You can pull it, and it should not come back. You can only hope that you got it before it actually produced seeds, and you'll have 20 more plants before the end of the summer. It looks very like another one that is very common, called redroot pigweed. In truth, I have trouble telling them apart, but I do have both of them. But do you really care? They're both weeds. They're easily recognized as a weed. It's as either copperleaf or redroot pigweed. Pull them both. You don't want either one of them, you know. Here's one that I have not seen in my garden, but Jean has seen in hers, and perhaps you'll see it too. It likes sunny places. This is purslane. Purslane actually looks kind of pretty, but it's one of those that's very difficult to get rid of again. Has a single stem, goes into the ground. If you can get the crown, you can probably get your purslane to disappear. It's actually edible, at least when it's young. I wouldn't recommend it personally. I'd rather do without it entirely. It has yellow flowers, but you really want to get it before then because it will go to seed. And it will root at the nodes so that you have many chances for it to spread itself, and you really don't want it to do that. Get it up, get it up. Now here's another one you'll see a lot of this time of year. This picture in the center is a very young plant. It probably looked like that back in early June, and it was hiding under every other plant that you own in your flower bed. It was lurking, waiting for hot weather. On the left, you see a drawing that will show you what the actual flowers look like when they're in full bloom. They don't open all the way. And yet they're rather dandelion-like. They don't open all the way. You never see anything better than that. And it produces eventually some fluffy wind-blown seeds that will go everywhere, and you'll have plenty more pileworts where this one came from. And it can be 8 feet tall by the end of the summer if you don't catch it. And you'll say, well, I got time. It hasn't bloomed all the way yet. And what you see is that's as much as you're going to get. It will just go ahead and spread seeds at that point, more than you are interested in having. Fortunately, this one, if you can recognize it, is easy to pull. It has very shallow root system, and it's quite close to the surface, so you can really get rid of it easily, provided you see it. Its main aim is to hide under the plants that are green until it's too late for you. Now we're going to look next at the horseweed again, because after that rosette form, it actually looks rather like this on the left here. Come on, where are we? Here we are. Looks like this on the left. And this time of year, you'll see some like that, and you'll see some like this. I've already talked about this one. It spreads mainly by seeds, so you need to catch it before this stage. And if you catch it before it goes to seed, most of these can be composted with no trouble. But if they go to seed, you'd really rather not do that. You don't need to put those seeds back on your best gardens. So look at that very plain thing. It looks almost like a zinnia or maybe an alyssum or something of that sort at that stage, but you need to be able to recognize it as weed and get rid of it. You see this horseweed name up here. That's because this one is also called horseweed, but if you look at the next one, this one is also called horseweed. This is why botanical names, when you're trying to pin something down, are often more useful than the actual common name, because this is a kind of ragweed, but it's also called horseweed. It may not be the kind of ragweed you're familiar with. The one with the fern leaf type leaves is a very common one. They're both the kind that will produce hay fever, and they should be starting to think about blooming right now. But look for this set of leaves here, these 3 little leaves, lobes on the leaves, and keep an eye out and get them before they go to this blooming stage, because as I'm sure you're aware, once you have ragweeds going to seed, you have them everywhere, if not that year, then next year. Ragweeds are definitely a problem. These get quite tall too. I've seen them 8 or 10 feet tall. So you'd really rather get them before they get to that stage. This is a smaller plant, but it's still one that you're going to have a little difficulty with. Remember I said about the purslane that it has a single root, but it roots at the nodes, and there is a set of flowers at every single leaf node just waiting there to go to seed, produce a new plant, or if it can't, then produce roots and spread in that way. The one on the left there is the one called spotted spurge. It's a flat mat-forming plant. It seems to kill everything underneath it too, so you'll have a big circle if you don't, of dead area if you don't get that one out when it's pretty young. It's hard to get out of a lawn because it doesn't mow well, and you don't really see it mixed in with the grass. At least in your flower beds, you can usually see it and get the worst of it out. There are other kinds of spurges that are tall. that are a little less flat than that one, but they all have a couple of characteristics. They all do this rooting at the leaf nodes, a single stem if you can get it out. They also have a milky sap, and the sap tends to be irritating to people. So if you're taking these out, try to do it without bare hands, wearing gloves of some sort. So that's one of our unfavorites, and it's definitely a hot weather plant. Like sun, you won't see it too much in the shade. Thistles also. Thistles are many kinds of thistles, frankly. They'll all have spiny leaves. They'll generally have a taproot. This is one where, like a dandelion, you really need to dig down and get all of the root out, or you are actually going to have trouble. You'll have extra plants next year from what was left of the root. They can get tall. They're really very pretty. They spread a lot by seed. So even if you get them all out of your property, your neighbor's property, or the next hedgerow over will probably produce some problems for you. So you have to keep an eye out for these. If you can catch them when they're still just a little rosette at the bottom, that would be a good thing. Usually the taproot is smaller at that point as well. All right, you're stuck. Weeds. You've got weeds. Now what do? You can see some of the things in here that you might recognize. I'm not going to go into all of them. If you're likely entertained by it, you can see what you can find in here, other than the poison ivy right up here. There are many other options in there to look at. So what we're going to focus on at this point, those were our favorite, our unfavorite rather, 10. We'll focus on how to deal with them. And prevention is really great. This one is a little rigid for my taste. I like things a bit more relaxed, but these folks have dealt with weeds on the theory that if you have no weeds, you won't have a weed problem. And they have corrected this in two ways, it looks like. And one is to be sure before they planted a bed that there were no weeds actually sprouting there. If you're starting a new bed, that's an excellent thing to do. If you're dealing with a bed that's already put together, the best way to try to fix that problem is to put on some mulch. Usually a 2 to 3 inch layer of an organic mulch of some kind is going to be your best option. If it decomposes, it's enriching the soil. You have to perhaps add some more in every few years, but 2 or 3 inches of mulch will tend to smother sprouting weed seeds because those sprouting weed seeds often need light in order to germinate. You may still have to deal with wind-blown ones like horseweed and dandelion and thistle and things like that, but this should make your problems much, much less. So prevention is great, but we're going to deal with how to get rid of what you've already got. As master gardeners, we tend to recommend that you dig and pull. Dig and pull is our favorite because it doesn't hurt the soil. You don't add extra substances that might or might not harm desirable plants. And you can probably get rid of most of your weeds that way if you catch them early enough and are vigilant. Notice we have a pair of gloves here, sitting here as a recommendation to be sure you don't, for instance, get bothered by the spurges or maybe by thistles or other pokey things. Also, we like to emphasize that you must both dig and pull. Some are very shallow and just a tug will get them out. Pilewort was like that. Some of them really need you to dig down in there in order to get a taproot or to collect all of the different roots that you can get. And then you can pull things very gently. Sometimes you have to get that root loose before you can get anything out. So both dig and pull, and we'll show you some tools that work well for that kind of thing. You can, in fact, fire the worst of your weeds with some reservations. I have never tried using a flamethrower to control weeds. It has its place. If you are, for instance, trying to control weeds inside a paver sidewalk that's been set in sand, you'll have weeds in the cracks. I have a neighbor who uses a flamethrower, a small one, on the curb, between the curb and the street, because there are always wind-blown weeds in there. And I have talked to people who've used it on raised beds for vegetables because it's a good way to clear whatever is growing there before you actually think about planting vegetables. Generally, the only caveat I have for this kind of thing that I've been told about is don't sit there and burn it out like you're trying to burn all of the root down to the ground. It really is best for controlling and burning the top growth. Otherwise, you might be sterilizing your soil. You might catch something, might crack your pavers. You never know exactly. So be reasonably careful about it. As always, read the directions. Your other option, if you have huge expanses to deal with that you can't do by hand, or a lawn to deal with, perhaps you may need to use an herbicide of some kind. We can't really go into herbicides today because, in fact, it takes at least an hour to begin to deal with the different things about herbicides. And we don't have that much time today. Totally separate talk. But if you feel that you need to do that, read the label on the one you've chosen and be sure you follow the directions. And remember, many of our members and many of you out there are going to be interested in organic answers to the weed problem. They are poisons too. It's not just the synthetic ones. The organic ones need some safety precautions as well. So read the label and follow it, whatever kind you choose. So we're going to look a little further about dig and pull. That's really our main point for that kind of thing. You need some good tools to do this with. These happen to be 3 of my favorites. You can see I was using them when I took that picture. I hadn't lost them even yet. That soil knife, also called a hori-hori knife in the Japanese format, is a very useful tool for digging 6 or 8 inches down. It's a very strong knife. You can get under things like dandelions and thistles with that and have some hope of getting at least most of the root out with it. It's also good for shallower things as well, but for shallower things, I like to use this one here. This one is called a Yankee weeder or a Cape Cod weeder. The blade is angled. It's not particularly sharp. It's good for underneath relatively shallow rooted plants. It loosens the soil, so it's a dig sort of operation, so that you can actually pull a shallow rooted plant without leaving very much of it behind. Very good for chickweed, for poa annua, the annual bluegrass, those kinds of things. Also would probably be very useful for spurge. We talked about spurge being shallow rooted and flat to the ground, but easy to break the roots off, so you'd rather not do that. The other hook has relatively limited uses, but where it's useful, it's really useful. It can dig down and get deep roots out, but what it really can do is dig between the roots of shrubs. If you've got dandelions between a couple of big roots or chickweeds and things like that, it can haul them out where you can get at them. All these things are good. You can buy them in a number of places as commercial products. Jean likes to remind you that you can use repurposed tools as well. Her favorite tool is this one here, this butcher knife that she found at a flea market. It serves the same purpose as a hori-hori knife. It has a sharp blade too. This digger here, a crooked and bent screwdriver that would be of no use to anybody, but it's good for digging plants out. And again, a standard dinner fork is another good way to work on this kind of thing. Now, let us just have a look here. As one reminder, it's not too late and it's not too early to start getting out there and pulling weeds. Many of them haven't gone to seed yet. Even if they have, maybe you can catch them before they completely go to seed. The too early one, you may recognize that one on the right as something you see a lot of in the early spring. That's a cool weather weed, a bittercress. And it'll just sit there until, you'll start to see them in January and February and March, just everywhere, in your flower beds, in your lawn. They go to seed, they produce massive quantities of seed. You'd think of it as a winter weed and you don't need to worry about it until maybe January. It is sprouting right now. Keep an eye out for it. It will sprout and lurk until the cool weather conditions have arrived. And so we come pretty much to the end of our talk here. Here are 3 different books that are very good for helping you recognize different weeds. You notice that 2 of them are actually wildflower books. But these books, the people who compiled these books have not really distinguished between things we think of as weeds and things we think of as wildflowers. So they're very helpful. And there is also a handout that you can download where you found the link for this particular talk, which will have references like this, a few web references, and a summary of our points. Well, now that concludes our presentation today on warm weather weed wrangling. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you learned something that will help you in your gardening endeavors, whether that means more blooms on your flowers and ornamental shrubs, attracting more pollinators to your garden, or improving your vegetable production. As we were not able to field your questions today, we want to close by offering you some ways to reach us. As you can see on this slide, we have a presence on Facebook. You may post questions to either of these Facebook pages. Feel free to upload a photo, especially if it helps to describe the problem you have. If you are not a Facebook user, you may call the Extension office at 865-215-2340 and leave a detailed message with your question. Your question will be forwarded to a master gardener to research and respond to you. You may also send an email to Ryland Thompson, the Knox County Extension agent who advises the local Master Gardener program. If a photo would help to describe the problem, feel free to attach one or two. Try to keep the total attachments to less than 5 megabytes. You may get a response directly from Ryland, or he may route your question to a Master Gardener to research and respond to you. We are eager to return to public presentations. In the meantime, you can watch any of our recorded presentations by going to our website, finding a Speakers Bureau event on the calendar, and clicking on the link that is included within the event details. Now, let's go get some dirt under our fingernails.